Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. We have never dealt with a federal agency that lies as flagrantly and as aggressively about literal life and death situations as Donald Trump and Kristi Noem's Department of Homeland Security. We, of course, as Americans, all saw this play out with the killing of Renee Good last month. You might remember Kristi Noem's false version of events issued right after the fatal shooting.
The officer was hit by the vehicle. She hit him. He went to the hospital. A doctor did treat him. You know, it's clearly established law that a vehicle driven by a person and used to harm someone is a deadly weapon. This domestic act of terrorism to use your vehicle to try to kill law enforcement officers is going to stop. And I'm asking the Department of Justice to prosecute it as domestic terrorism because it's clear that it's being coordinated. People are being trained and told how to use their vehicles to impede law enforcement operations and then to run over anybody who gets in their way. We had law enforcement officers that were out there doing an enforcement action. And a vehicle got stuck in the snow, and so they had called for other people to come and help them get that vehicle out. Those officers were trying to free the vehicle when the harassment started, when the protesters were out there impeding their vehicles and preventing them from leaving the scene.
Of course, we all saw the video of Renee Good getting shot, multiple videos, in fact, from multiple angles. We could see that Noem's version of events were an obvious fabrication. She was just lying about what happened. And Renee Good was not some sort of Antifa super soldier out to murder federal agents, to drive over anybody who got in her way. She was a mom driving a Honda Pilot with stuffed animals in the glove box, who used her very last words on this earth to assure the agent who would go on to kill her, quote, "I'm not mad at you." And then, of course, it didn't stop there. DHS did the exact same thing a few weeks later after Alex Preddy was executed at point-blank range. As soon as it was discovered he was legally carrying a firearm, they spun up a whole narrative.
An individual approached U.S. Border Patrol officers with a 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The officers attempted to disarm this individual, but the armed suspect reacted violently. Fearing for his life and for the lives of his fellow officers around him, an agent fired defensive shots. This looks like a situation where an individual arrived at the scene to inflict maximum damage on individuals and to kill law enforcement.
Stephen Miller called Preddy an assassin on social media, that he wanted to murder federal agents. Vice President J.D. Vance retweeted those comments. An assassin who tried to murder federal agents. Again, we all saw the video. We all know what actually happened. The gun that Preddy was carrying legally, which he never held nor brandished, was removed from Preddy before he was shot, while lying prone on the ground on all fours with a gun just a few inches from his body. And Alex Preddy was not a domestic terrorist trying to inflict maximum damage and kill law enforcement. That official story, promulgated by Kristi Noem and Stephen Miller and J.D. Vance and the government that is our government, was a lie. They're lying to you. They're lying to us. They know it. In fact, they seem proud of it.
Have you apologized? Did you plan to apologize to the family of Alex Preddy?
For what?
For, labeling him an assassin with ill intent.
Well, again, I just described to you what I said about Alex Preddy, which is that he's a guy who showed up with ill intent to an ICE protest.
No, but if it's determined that his civil rights were violated by this FBI investigation, will you apologize to that
So if this hypothetical leads to that hypothetical leads to another hypothetical,
it's a real case.
Will I do it?
It's not just Minneapolis either. Do you remember the story of Miramar Martinez? That's the teacher's assistant who was shot 5 times by Border Patrol in Chicago during their Operation Midway Blitz. Now, again, we got initial news reports in which DHS says she tried to ambush CBP agents and ram them with her car. They even arrested and charged her with assault. Now, what happened was those charges were dropped basically as soon as the case went to discovery, because in discovery, the government's narrative was going to fall completely apart. You see, the agent who shot Martinez was found to have sent a text message to other agents bragging about what he had done. Quote, "I fired 5 rounds and she had 7 holes. Put that in your book, boys." Yesterday, Martinez spoke to Congress about what she experienced.
The mental scars will always be there as a reminder of the time my own government attempted to execute me, and when they fell, they chose to vilify me. I am Renee Good. I am Alex Preddy. I am Silverio Villegas Gonzalez. I am Keith Porter. They should all be here today. I know each of them would trade my bullet wounds a lifetime of mental distress and a heartbeat to be able to be back with their loved ones this afternoon.
Again, this woman was arrested after they shot her a bunch of times. She had to get herself to a hospital, and they came into the hospital and were impatient, the doctors there said, to get her out of there so that they could take her to detention. Now, this has been this administration's MO from the beginning. I mean, remember this one. These things sort of come, they enter the news cycle, and they go away, and then we sort of lose track of them. Remember this? We covered on this show that really big, flashy Chicago raid from last year. It looked like they were like cutting a war film, right? The one where they landed a Black Hawk helicopter on a residential apartment building in the South Shore neighborhood, which is just like a very random, like residential neighborhood. And at the time, the administration said that this was a targeted raid on the Tren de Aragua gang members, right? That's the gang in Venezuela that they've accused of being narco-terrorists, that they sort of use as a justification for all those people they've killed in the Caribbean, right? They said, this was their justification, the building was occupied by these violent gang member Venezuelan migrants. It was a total lie. To this day, they haven't offered any evidence to back up that claim. That was the claim they used to justify this insane raid. In reality, according to arrest records published by ProPublica today, and kudos to them, they've done great reporting, quote, agents wrote they launched the operation based on intelligence there were illegal aliens unlawfully occupying apartments. They said they focused their search on units that were not legally rented or leased at the time. In other words, there was a tip or allegation that some people were squatting in an apartment building. No mention at all of Tren de Aragua. Do you think squatters need a U.S. military helicopter and people rappelling off the sides, and for kids to be pulled out of the building and put in zip ties, and for the residents of the building, American and immigrant, to be separated by race and put into trucks? That's not the only DHS narrative that completely fell apart this week. Because back in January, it was after the shooting of Renee Good, but before the shooting of Alex Preddy, a federal agent shot someone else, a person in the leg in Minneapolis. And we covered it here on the show as it unfolded. And as is often the case with these events, there's very little information in the beginning. And most news outlets are careful, right? Don't want to get it wrong. Want to make sure we can confirm what we have. DHS rushes out a story, just like Alex Preddy and Renee Good. So here's what DHS said at the time. During an attempt to arrest a suspect, quote, 2 subjects came out of a nearby apartment and attacked the law enforcement officer with a snow shovel and broom handle. Fearing for his life and safety as he was being ambushed by 3 individuals, the officer fired a defensive shot to defend his life. Now, that does sound, in that telling, like a totally justified use of force. Witnesses on the scene have repeatedly said that was a lie. In fact, what they said was the agent shot at them through their front door. Can you shoot at someone defensively through a closed front door? New reporting from the Star Tribune, again, who's been doing great reporting, now backs him up. The Star Tribune reviewed photos, which have now been shown in court, of what appears to be a bullet hole. Quote, the hole appears several inches to the right of the door hinge. Pictures from inside the home indicate the bullet fragment ultimately hit a bedroom wall down the hall, suggesting it traveled between a mattress and a portable crib in a room where several children sleep. Federal judge overseeing that case has ordered ICE to release the 2 Venezuelans who were in detention. And that bullet, as you see there, was later recovered by Minnesota law enforcement. So it sure doesn't sound like the officer in question shot at the man in self-defense while they were beating him with a shovel and a broom, if he shot through the front door of the house. DHS declined to comment to the Star Tribune regarding this new evidence. I could go longer. Well, I mean, we are keeping this to the most salient cases. There's more we had to leave on the cutting room floor. And in the macro sense, it is clear this administration knows they are losing the PR battle in Minnesota. Today, Trump's so-called border czar, Tom Homan, announced he's withdrawing 700 immigration agents from the state, which will leave more than 2,000 agents on the ground there. Just to keep in mind, there's normally about 150 total. So we're still talking order of magnitude larger. Trump himself acknowledged maybe he needs a new public approach.
I learned that maybe we can use a little bit of a softer touch, but you still have to be tough. These are criminals. We're dealing with really hard criminals. But look, I've called the people. I've called the governor. I've called the mayor, spoke to him, had great conversations with him.
Oh, hard criminals like Liam Ramos, the 5-year-old boy in the Spider-Man backpack, or the poet, mother of 3, or the VA ICU nurse. Make no mistake, they are not changing course.
Covering President Trump, pulling ICE and federal agents from Minneapolis. This is a clearly measurable step by the Trump administration amid what have been ongoing protests and backlash that has overwhelmed them and their message. The announcement actually made by the very official that Trump sent to Minnesota after agents killed a protester and they wanted to change the so-called face of operations there. Tom Homan stating that 700 agents are leaving now, immediately. That is a measurable drawdown. We also want you to have the full picture. It still leaves about 2,000 agents there, which is unusual. This whole way that Trump has been putting ICE and DHS agents in these places has been unusual. And they are part of a larger force that we know has been drawing the protests over everything from the masked policing to the menacing of American citizens. Some agents caught on camera threatening people, threatening to punish First Amendment rights, the unprofessional and untrained tactics, and what you see on your screen, the 2 Americans slain, which has shocked the nation's conscience. So before I go any further, let me just tell you what the facts are here tonight. President Trump is reducing the forces there. That's a fact. And the Trump administration is publicizing it. For a very PR-conscious president, that shows the impact of these protests and the pressure and this backlash, because there has been, at the political level, a failure by the administration to do what it so often does, to try to change the subject, replacing one outrage with another, with one topic with another. Trump has done that. That's one of his well-known media political tactics, something that even his critics say, with lament, that he is effective at, because he has been a reality show star, a self-promoter, an early Twitter adopter. Everybody knows how he does that, and it's failed here. So now, after all of this and those deaths and these other problems, the Trump administration is trying to shift both message and policy. And that means there can still be the usual exaggerations. As journalists, we try to fact check and cover what's happening. But there is a shift. Activists warning the administration has a much more to do if it is going to actually respect the Constitution and public safety in Minnesota and elsewhere, which is why protesters are continuing on many efforts. There's now about 30,000 people and counting trained as constitutional observers. That's in that state alone. Across the country, this issue has become a focal point for the protests against Trump and the king-like efforts to search or patrol or police and even kill, all without the legal oversight that this country has long demanded, especially of federal government intrusions into what is usually local police tactics. The administration initially tried to ignore and criticize and even mock the many millions of Americans who turned out across this year, the second term. And we've covered how some have folded like CEOs and read, while other groups, protesters, citizens on juries, many journalists, have not been cowed. But the approach is failing because the administration is now, both, as I mentioned, in the drawdown and in its messaging, trying to at least say they are offering something back to those many millions of protesters. The Trump administration has reached a point where it does not want to risk looking like it cannot see any aspect of a problem that is before all of us, that Americans have seen across the political spectrum with their own eyes. Because when you see masked ICE agents menacing people as they've been caught on video, killing Americans, and then a government lying about those videos, and then the government initially saying they wouldn't even investigate or have any rule of law for this, no. That's a problem people see. Drawing down several hundred agents who are a part of that is a way of saying, hey, we get it, even if people can debate whether they get it at all yet. Rachel Maddow has been reporting on the results from those protests, including halting the construction of new ICE centers.
We are seeing continued rolling, huge anti-ICE protests everywhere now.
So these wonderful patriots have defeated the concentration camp.
My director of inspections, licenses, and permits revoked the building permit for this detention center.
Are they going to be able to build a huge permanent archipelago of camps of lawless prison camps? There's pushback everywhere, including in red states, red counties, and red cities, that says no.
Pushback everywhere saying no. Pushback of huge, measurable levels. Citizens also showing courage in places where we just watch agents kill their neighbors, even as CEOs and elites fold. Local officials using powers. We can take it off let's take off that video for a sec. I'm getting so many flashes. Local officials using powers that they have to thwart the ICE tactics in any way they can. As Rachel described there, this is still a country we have here. That means there's local officials. That means there's different power centers. There is federalism and there's capitalism, which sometimes is seen as going along with anything. But capitalism can also mean the public demanding rules, human rights, values, rule of law on the companies that they have any leverage for. Then we've reported on Democrats in D.C. who are in the minority but are now trying new ways to protect the public, from using that shutdown clash to taking testimony from witnesses in public, which we heard this week about these killings. That alone is powerful because the Trump DOJ has signaled that in some of these cases, it may not even bother fully investigating killings of Americans. So Democrats in that sad, obviously regrettable situation are not just writing letters criticizing it, but taking the testimony in public themselves. This is what people saw. This is how this killing went down. Here's the question about whether this person should still be walking around with a gun, making a salary from your tax dollars, let alone the more long-term legal question, which has to be investigated, whether anyone committed a crime pursuant to those Americans shot to death. I will tell you, an aggressive government can leave people feeling abused and hopeless. Politics sometimes, even as people are dying, can feel like it's viewed by many as a game, with political hacks deliberately trying to leave people feeling powerless, like their voice doesn't matter, like protest will be met with more of the very things that people are protesting, including government violence and abuse, something we've covered dates all the way back to earlier, uglier periods in our history. And yet some of these activists are now seizing lawful, peaceful, and effective power. It's happening before our eyes with, as I mentioned, at least some measurable results without any indication that Trump has retracted the ICE agenda. I say that by way of introduction to a special guest tonight to start the program, because we have a familiar beat guest, Jake Homanduri, an Obama campaign veteran, and Aru Shiny-Ajay, who directs the Sunrise Movement in Minneapolis, which has organized protests like this one we mentioned that pressures hotels to stop housing ICE agents, that pressures local businesses, that tries to have lawful direct action, and as we see on our cameras there, people at night trying to make sure their voices are also heard, even at a time where some of their neighbors were killed. Welcome to both of you. Aru, your thoughts on what works and what you say to people who do feel potentially dispirited, which I mentioned can be part of the agenda.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything that we've seen in the last 3 weeks since Renee Good was first murdered is an incredible example of what organized people can do. We're at a point now where in Minneapolis, 5% of every single neighborhood is in a Signal chat organizing to be able to respond to ICE's overreach. It's an incredible density. And what we've seen is that that network of ordinary citizens was basically able to force the U.S. government to take a step back. To force the government back is an incredibly powerful thing. And it happened because of the density of organizing happening right now. It happened because, and you can hear this from Greg Bovino himself, it happened because his agents can't go anywhere without getting yelled at, getting blocked from the roads, getting noise outside the hotels they sleep at, getting refused service at restaurants. We're making it impossible for them to operate, and that is having success.
Yeah, and you're doing that against the pushback and sometimes possibly illegal crackdowns. Just a couple of headlines here. Homeland Security forcing tech companies to hand over data about Trump critics. There can be times where that's legal. There can definitely be times where it violates the First Amendment, depending on the details. The DHS having these secretive subpoenas, again, around Americans. When we talk about sometimes now security letters or that being used against possibly foreign terror attacks, legally that's been allowed. Whether that can work against Americans in the long run once exposed is a big question. And you see local coverage in Maine, ICE demanding a Maine sheriff's employment records. result after he criticized it, which shows you, as is often the case when there's autocratic creep, Aru, someone who's devoted their life to being in law enforcement in Maine, learning very quickly that if you exercise First Amendment rights, sheriffs can obviously speak on these matters. There may be a DHS Trump crackdown. Your view of how your teams are fighting this, you can't minimize it and say it's not a risk, but how are you fighting it and sort of keeping spirits up?
I mean, I think that something very beautiful was unleashed in the Twin Cities the last 3 weeks, this sense of solidarity, of being on the same team. I think about the moment after Alex Priddy was killed. I drove out to a few blocks, or the block where he was shot. And the minute that I got there, I saw this man getting tackled to the ground and having tear gas sprayed at him. And a couple of us pulled him up, and I remember grabbing snow and pushing it to his face to wipe off the tear gas. And there was just this fear, but also this sense of we're in it together. And I think that's what it is at the end of the day. People are seeing crisis happen, and it is actually calling us closer together and into more bravery and more courage. So yeah, there might be tracking and there might be surveillance, but I think courage models courage, and hundreds of thousands of people are finding that out right now.
Che, what does political history teach us about what Aru is sharing there?
Well, I think that courage is contagious. And I think you definitely saw that with what Aru and the Sunrise Movement and the people of Minnesota did in pushing back against Trump and MAGA. And what it really did show us is that, normal people taking to the streets are far more powerful than any of these elites who have coddled to Trump, who have surrendered to Trump could ever imagine. As another famous Minnesotan said, the times they are a-changing. And the reality is that the MAGA vibe shift that people talked about a year and a half ago, that caused all this elite surrender to Trump, it is now shifted back. And it is shifted back because of the people of Minnesota.
Joining us, Professor of Law at Hofstra University, James Sample, former United States District Judge in the Southern District of New York, Judge Shira Shenlin, host of the Bulwark podcast, and MS Now political analyst Tim Miller, and Semaphore Congressional Bureau Chief Burgess Everett. Tim, can you tell that that soundbite from the speaker, that it looks on its face to be fraudulent, I don't know, got stuck in my craw today?
Well, you're channeling my rage, so you're doing my job for me in the commentary seat. But look, I just would add a few things to be specific about it. Number one, the thing that he described there that looks fraudulent, and we can be honest, he knows better. He knows it's not fraudulent. This is a lie that the Speaker of House is perpetrating on the country because it gives them, he perceives, potential political advantage in the future. But what he described is the thing that looks fraudulent is otherwise known as counting votes. Yeah, and this just happens in anything in life. Sometimes you're watching a sports game and some team's leading and then the other team makes more baskets after that, then they win. The fact that there were 3 occasions where there was a Republican who led in the first tranche of ballots and then another tranche came in and they were behind, that's normal. That could happen because it came in from a more blue part of the district. It could happen because the Republicans, Mike Johnson himself, have been just railing against mail-in voting, and so only Democrats do mail-in voting now. So there are tons of logical reasons for this. It's just important to say. I think the thing that he said to me that is the most alarming, though, about what's to come is specifically pointing out California. And I think that there is legitimate critique of California's ballot counting. In a first-world country, it shouldn't take a month to count the votes. But the problem is, I think now Mike Johnson is already signaling that they're going to use their illegitimate arguments to try to create trouble between Election Day and when the ballots are actually counted in California, and they might use the perception or their lies about fraud to prevent new Democrats, let's say, from being seated. And I think that's a real potential threat as we look ahead to about this time next year.
Burgess, how widespread is commentary like that among Republicans in Congress?
I mean, it comes, it goes, it ebbs and flows a little bit. I remember after the 2020 election and when Trump began contesting it and trying to overturn it eventually, there were a bunch of Republicans who ended up disagreeing with that attempt, who were kind of saying, well, we should look into this, we should look into fraud. It's possible that the president actually won. And I remember that pretty vividly because these were people that ended up disagreeing with the president on this front. So I think what we're hearing from the speaker right there is probably a little bit of an attempt to get in Trump's good graces and harmonize with him. I'm not really aware of any negotiations going on Capitol Hill with regards to a bipartisan elections law. So I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to there. There is a Republican bill called the SAVE Act that is being talked about, that is voter ID, and we can get more into that if you want to, but that seems to be the proposal that's kind of out there right now.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a moment, but let's talk about the harmonizing, as you just mentioned, Burgess. And James, on the harmonizing with the president on elections being fraudulent or not being fair because suddenly Republicans start losing as ballots are counted, which is, again, how Tim explains how elections work. When you harmonize with the president on that, what you do is you create the circumstances for a vast number of Americans to decide that the election is not fair because they didn't win and they're angry about it. And then you have the conditions for what happened on January 6th.
Yeah, no.
Didn't they learn that lesson?
Well, you're absolutely right. Whether they learned the lesson or not, that's hard to say. But to Tim's point about counting, absolutely, and Mike Johnson knows that. Mike Johnson's comment there is a piece in a larger puzzle. And it's an indication that these words are also combined with action, right? President Trump may talk about things that sound crazy, but he always has somebody willing to take some action. He may talk about trying to take over Greenland, but there's at least an attempt. And yes, he was rebuffed. But if you think about Mike Johnson's comment, it is a brick in the wall, just like Steve Bannon saying we're going to have ICE at the polling places, just like Tulsi Gabbard going down to Georgia, just like all of these things that get to, the threats against election officials, the rhetoric about voter fraud that doesn't exist. When you talk about nationalizing elections, especially nationalizing them on a partisan basis, we need Republicans to take over 15 states. You're not actually trying to promote election integrity. You are affirmatively seeking to undermine election integrity as a predicate to do things that are also unconstitutional.
Yeah, and they're being pretty open about it. Let's listen. You mentioned Steve Bannon. Let's listen to him.
You're damn right. We're going to have ICE surround the polls come November. We're not going to sit here and allow you to steal the country again. And you can whine and cry and throw your toys out of the pram all you want, but we will never again allow an election to be stolen.
The election wasn't stolen. When you're talking about people who were not supposed to vote in elections, the idea that there's fraud, the number is minuscule. Minuscule. In Georgia, I think it was 8 people total that weren't citizens who voted fraudulently, but 8 people in Fulton County in the ballots that they just seized. But this messaging is pervasive, and it is preying upon people who want to be convinced that they're being sidelined, that the government is corrupt.
Well, but there's a really important point to make. It's about deterring and depressing the vote. Yeah. If you instill fear in the voters, if they think they're going to go to the polls and find armed masked agents, they just might not go to the polls.
Armed masked agents, by the way, who just killed 2 American citizens.
I understand that. So if you say, should I vote today or not? Maybe I'd better not go. I think it's a campaign to deter and depress the vote, because otherwise they don't think they're going to win the next 2 elections. And this is a reaction to the fear of not winning. And things got worse today. The Supreme Court is letting the California map go forward.
Why is that worse?
Because there's 5 seats now in California that can go through. So I'm just saying worse in the sense Republicans are more worried that they won't win the midterms or the presidential.
So when Donald Trump talks about federalizing election, he can't federalize an election. That's Congress's purview. The elections are up to the states. He can't do a lot of the things that he's arguing, executive order to end mail-in ballot, but he's putting it out there. What can he do, James, other than surrounding ICE around ballot boxes and intimidating at the polls? What can the president do to disrupt?
Well, Article 1, Section 4 gives the power to the states, but it does give Congress a backup role. So the question in terms of what he can do, it really goes to Burgess's answer with regard to the SAVE Act, or the new SAVE Act 2.0, which is not just voter ID. It also has...
Should we get Burgess to explain it to us before we go into this?
Sure.
Sorry for interrupting. Burgess, explain the SAVE Act.
Well, as he was referring to, they're working on an updated version of it, but the general gist here is to require proof of citizenship before you can vote. And a lot of Republicans were trying to attach it to this government funding bill just a few days ago and they were basically backed down by the president and said that the Senate had made a commitment to either use its rules or change its rules to be able to pass it by a simple majority. You know, we're finding out in the aftermath of that that's not the case. The Senate Republicans don't have a plan to do that, and they're not going to change the rules. So this bill doesn't really face any sort of path to law. And I'm also reminded 4 years ago, Democrats were very concerned with some of the changes that states were making, like Georgia, to their own election laws. So they had a national response to that failed in the Senate, and they tried to change the rules for that as well. And Republicans all opposed that. So it's interesting how it only took 4 years for the shoe to end up totally on the other foot.
Good point, James.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think wherever one stands on the filibuster, it is times like this where party control is consolidated entirely across Senate, House, and the White House, where the filibuster does really have some real teeth and some real value, because concentrated control and the ability to write the rules of the game is a dangerous combination, which is why we have a decentralized system. The irony in terms of what Burgess is referencing, and he's absolutely right there about the juxtaposition of left and right with respect to state control versus federal control, is the one area where Congress is given greater authority in elections is with respect to instances in which states have a history of racial discrimination. The Voting Rights Act. Well, what is the Supreme Court engaged in? Basically the final hours of striking down and putting the nail in the coffin. The one area where federal control, and yes, that's pushed by the left, anti-discrimination practices that are a part and parcel of the Voting Rights Act, one of the most successful pieces of legislation ever. That's on the chopping block, but the Republicans want to have voter purges, proof of citizenship, and mail-in balloting. That's the difference. It's not just a juxtaposition. You have to dig down into the merits of what they're trying to accomplish.
So, Judge, part of what stopped 2020 from getting overturned was Donald Trump brought a number of cases in front of judges, and I think all but one of them were thrown out. But we've seen, and we just covered this a moment ago, in Minnesota, where a judge was exasperated, and so was the federal prosecutor, the line prosecutor. The judge is saying, why is the administration not complying with these court orders? And she said, I don't know. I keep trying to get them to do so. Please put me in contempt and throw me in jail for a night so I can get some sleep. This is a federal prosecutor saying this. So what happens if the administration, if there are cases brought and the administration just doesn't follow the court orders?
So we've been asking that for months now. What is the remedy if these court orders aren't followed? And the only thing we can come up with, and I say we because judges have been talking about this, is contempt of court. And that can be a criminal contempt or a civil contempt. Are you going to start throwing federal prosecutors into jail? Obviously not. Why? Because they're resigning. They're resigning by the tens and dozens, maybe hundreds by now, because they don't want to carry out these orders, and they don't want to lie to courts, and they don't want to disobey courts.
But you have to go up the chain then, and then what happens? Are you in a constitutional crisis where one branch of government is trying to imprison another branch of government?
That's exactly what a contempt would be. If a federal prosecutor disobeyed a court order, the only remedy that really makes sense is contempt. That's right. And who's going to prosecute that contempt? Because usually it's the executive branch. So now you need a special person outside to do that prosecution.
You got to look at what they're doing.
Right.
And the fact that, we're taking 200 of 3,000 out of Minnesota. And then this evening, just moments ago, to the audience of one, as Alicia pointed out, reassuring him, no, mass deportations, we're still going on with that. If you're an illegal alien, first off, the only alien are Holman and his thugs. Those are the aliens here. Because this is not the American spirit or the American way. How do you, every day, walk into that building across the hall, knowing that you are surrounded by a bunch of individuals who don't give a damn about who you represent being there, and don't give a damn about the people out there who are scared and frightened right now, whose kids won't go outside and play, who are concerned about their parents taking them to school because they may get snatched up by ICE? What do you say to them? What do we do in this moment? How should we characterize this when Mr. Holman is telling us I'm saying us, not just Hispanics and other people of color, but all of us. You're on the list and you're an alien, you're gone.
You know, it amazes me that I'm in a room with a bunch of people who have no empathy and seemingly no understanding. And so what I keep telling the community members at large, if you have a representative that is not representing your interests, that aren't representing your communities, then get rid of them. We have an opportunity in the midterm to do that. Like, the way ICE is treating people is inhumane. It is without regard and without any empathy or feeling, but it's also against our Constitution. And so when we look at the law, that everyone has due process. This administration is choosing not to adhere to the law, period. And what we're doing is, we have press conferences and we're telling Noam to get out. Miller needs to get out. When we're assuming, and I think incorrectly, that Noam is the one that is creating policy. I don't think she has the bandwidth to do that. No. I think Stephen Miller, and he's just a weird little man who has a lot of power and has been empowered to do that.
To him directly.
Absolutely. And that's where we have to continue to fight for the people who sent us here and get rid of those who aren't doing their job and allowing our country to become neighborhoods and communities that are living in constant fear.
Melanie Stansbury, Congresswoman, she had just some very pointed comments yesterday in this forum that Democrats held on Capitol Hill. I want you all to take a listen to what she had to say about ICE.
Over the last year, over 37 individuals have died in immigrant detention. Multiple people have been murdered and gunned down in the street. We have 3 individuals in front of us here today who, in front of the entire world, their lives were shattered. And this was not an accident or of lack of training. This is the policy of the United States government, and it is being paid for by your tax dollars.
Congresswoman Melanie Stansbury of New Mexico, she makes a very important and I think pointed point here. We keep hearing a lot about how people just need more training. But it seems to me that Secretary Noem is unable to rein in the rogue elements of the organizations within her agency. And that is why there has to be a serious conversation about should they continue to have funding. And I mean they, Customs and Border Patrol. I think there should be a conversation about should they be funded more than 100 miles from the border? Because they are the ones that are also wreaking terror on Americans. This is not the same organization. Or maybe it is.
Training is important, but leadership is more important. What we're seeing is from the top, and the ICE agents and the Border Patrol officers that are involved in the Minneapolis operation and around the country understand what they're supposed to do. Secretary Noem isn't trying to rein them in. They have a quota that they're supposed to meet every day. They're supposed to get 3,000 arrests. They're supposed to get 1 million deportations a year. They can't do that if they're not doing some of what they're doing. There simply aren't enough people with criminal backgrounds to arrest to meet the quotas.